The restaurant was alive with the soft clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversations, and the golden glow of chandeliers. It wasn't just any restaurant. It was the kind of place where power was displayed as much on the plates as in the suits worn by its guests. At one table sat a man whose presence seemed to command the room without him even trying. A Chinese billionaire, known not only for his wealth but also for his arrogance. That night, however, something unexpected happened. The billionaire's laughter, sharp and dismissive, cut across the air, directed not at a competitor, not at a peer, but at the restaurant's black waiter. What followed would silence the room, shake the billionaire's pride, and leave the world with a story they would never forget. And before we dive into how this unforgettable confrontation unfolded, pause for a moment, because this story is one you don't want to miss. Make sure to hit that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if you believe stories like this need to be told. Your voice matters, and together, we can keep important conversations alive. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. The waiter's name was Marcus Johnson, a young man in his late 20s, tall, with a presence that carried both quiet dignity and humility. He wasn't just a waiter, he was a man with dreams, with intelligence, with resilience forged by years of hardship. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood, Marcus knew the value of patience, of biting back words when the world tried to put him down. He worked at this upscale restaurant not because it was his ultimate goal, but because it was a stepping stone. The truth was, Marcus had always been fascinated by cultures, languages, and the power of understanding people beyond the surface. Few knew that outside of work, he spent countless hours studying, listening, and practicing. His co-workers often teased him for the thick books he carried on breaks, the notebooks filled with scribbles of words and phrases in languages that weren't his own. But Marcus smiled it off, knowing knowledge was a weapon, and one day, he might need it. On this particular evening, the restaurant was buzzing louder than usual. Word had spread that Zhao Liang, the billionaire industrialist from Shanghai, would be dining there with his entourage. Zhao was the type of man whose reputation preceded him, ruthless in business, feared by competitors, and admired by many for his rise from poverty to staggering wealth. Yet beneath the admiration was a darker truth. Zhao was known for belittling those he saw as beneath him. His words were often daggers, and he used them freely. As Marcus adjusted his tie and prepared to approach Zhao's table, he reminded himself to stay professional. This was just another guest, another table, another night, but little did he know, this encounter would not only test his composure, it would change the trajectory of his life forever. When Marcus arrived at the billionaire's table, the group was already deep in conversation, speaking rapidly in Mandarin. Zhao Liang barely looked at Marcus at first, flicking his hand dismissively. To order drinks, Marcus, as always, remained calm and collected, jotting everything down with precision. But then, Zhao turned his attention toward him, and the atmosphere shifted. With a smirk tugging at his lips, Zhao began speaking again in Mandarin, only this time. His tone was mocking, his eyes scanning Marcus up and down as though he were less than human. The table erupted in laughter, loud and cruel, and though Marcus didn't flinch, his heart tightened in his chest. Marcus didn't need to understand every word to know what was happening. He could feel it. But what Zhao and his entourage didn't know was that Marcus wasn't as oblivious as they assumed. He understood more than they realized. He had studied Mandarin in his spare time, fascinated by the challenge, determined to master it. And as Zhao's laughter echoed across the room, Marcus realized this was no ordinary insult. This was a line being crossed. The laughter spread to nearby tables, not because they understood the words, but because of the contagious energy of mockery. To them, it looked like a scene of power, a rich man putting a waiter in his place. But soon, that illusion would shatter. The sound of Zhao Liang's laughter carried through the chandelier-lit dining room, commanding attention like the crack of a whip. His entourage leaned into the performance, adding their own chuckles and whispers, their eyes darting toward Marcus as though he were nothing more than a prop in Zhao's evening entertainment. Marcus stood still, his notepad resting lightly in his hand. His years of experience had taught him to maintain composure, to wear a mask of calm even when the storm was raging inside. But this storm was different. The insult wasn't hidden, it was deliberate, pointed, and cruel. Zhao leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of wine with exaggerated ease. He spoke again in Mandarin, this time louder, making sure the waiter was included in the ridicule. His words, dripping with mockery, compared Marcus to a servant too clumsy to even shine shoes properly. His entourage howled with laughter. A few even clapped their hands against the polished mahogany table as if Zhao had just delivered the punchline of a grand joke. Marcus understood. He caught every single word. His pulse quickened, but his expression remained steady. Years of discipline, both in life and in his secret studies, had prepared him for moments like this. Marcus wasn't just a man trying to make ends meet. He was a man who believed in dignity, in standing tall even when the world tried to push him down. And right then, the world, represented by Zhao Liang's arrogance, was daring him to remain silent. But Marcus wasn't built for silence, not anymore. The other guests in the restaurant began to notice. At first, they were unsure what was happening. Some assumed Zhao was simply giving instructions in his native tongue. But the looks of amusement, the exaggerated gestures, the way Zhao pointed at Marcus, it was clear this was mockery, pure and simple. One couple sitting nearby whispered to each other, their eyes narrowing at the scene. A businessman at another table frowned, shaking his head in disapproval. Yet none of them moved. None of them spoke up. That was the way of the world. People often watched injustice like it was theater, too afraid or too uncomfortable to intervene. And Zhao Liang knew it. He thrived on it. Leaning forward now, Zhao tapped Marcus's arm with the back of his hand, dismissive and belittling. He muttered another phrase in Mandarin, comparing Marcus to a dog who fetched plates instead of guarding a door. Again, the entourage roared with laughter, their voices bouncing against the marble walls. Marcus inhaled slowly, his chest rising as though he were drawing not just air, but strength. The time had come. In his mind, Marcus remembered nights alone at his small apartment, headphones on, repeating Mandarin phrases into the mirror. He remembered the odd stares from co-workers who couldn't understand why a young black man from Texas was pouring his free time into learning a language most people thought he'd never need. But Marcus knew better. Knowledge was never wasted, and tonight, all those hours were about to pay off. He straightened his posture, closed his notepad, and looked directly into Zhao Liang's eyes. His voice, calm but firm, broke the laughter like glass shattering on a tile floor. "Sir," Marcus said slowly, "I understood every word you just said." The table froze. For the first time that evening, Zhao's smirk faltered. The entourage glanced at each other, confused. Marcus let the silence hang for a moment, then leaned forward slightly, his tone sharpening like the edge of a blade. "And if you think mocking me makes you powerful, you're about to learn a very different lesson." The room had gone silent now. Forks hovered above plates, glasses paused midair. All eyes were on Marcus and Zhao, as though the restaurant itself had become a stage and every guest an audience member waiting for the next act. Zhao blinked, recovering his arrogance, his lips curling into another mocking smile. "Oh," he said in English this time, his accent thick but clear. "You think you can talk back to me?" Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he allowed himself the faintest of smiles, because what came next would not just silence Zhao, it would expose him. The tension in the restaurant was electric. Conversations had ceased, the clinking of silverware replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press against every wall. Zhao Liang's entourage exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain whether their laughter should continue or die quietly on their lips. Marcus stood tall, his notepad now set aside as though he no longer wore the apron of a waiter but the armor of dignity. His gaze never wavered from Zhao's, calm yet unyielding. "You see," Marcus began, his voice steady, echoing just enough to command the room. "You assumed your words were safe because you thought I wouldn't understand them. You thought language was a shield, a weapon only you could wield. But the truth is, I've been studying Mandarin for years, and I understood everything." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. A young couple near the bar leaned forward, stunned. Even the Mactor D, who who had been frozen in the corner, adjusted his stance as though bracing himself for what was about to unfold. Zhao Liang's smirk faltered, but he masked it quickly with a dismissive wave of his hand. "So what? A few words, that doesn't change who you are." His tone was sharp now, edged with the irritation of a man whose control was slipping. Marcus stepped closer to the table, not menacingly, but with quiet confidence that carried far more weight than aggression. "No," he replied, his eyes never leaving Zhao's, "but it changes everything about who you are." The room tightened around them. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't just a waiter standing up to a wealthy guest. This was something deeper, more symbolic. Marcus continued, his words deliberate, his tone powerful without rising in volume. "You hide behind your money, your language, your entourage. You think mocking those you see as beneath you makes you untouchable. But let me tell you something. Respect isn't bought. It isn't demanded. And it sure as hell isn't earned by tearing others down." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Heads nodded subtly, eyes fixed on Marcus. For once, Zhao's entourage didn't laugh. Their chuckles had evaporated, replaced by uncertainty, their loyalty wobbling in the shadow of Marcus's conviction. Zhao tried to reclaim the stage, leaning back with forced arrogance. "You dare lecture me? You're just..." But Marcus cut him off, not by raising his voice, but by speaking in flawless, measured Mandarin. Every word was clear, precise, and sharp as glass. He repeated Zhao's insults, word for word back to him, the phrases Zhao had used to demean Marcus, comparing him to a dog, a servant, someone unworthy. But Marcus didn't just echo them. He flipped them, twisting the blade of truth. With each phrase, Marcus reframed the insult, exposing it for what it was: cowardice. "You called me a dog," Marcus said in Mandarin, his pronunciation impeccable. "But the only dog here is a man who barks for attention while hiding behind wealth." A stunned silence filled the restaurant. "You called me unworthy," Marcus continued, his voice steady. "But worth is measured by character, not bank accounts. And tonight, every person in this room sees your character for what it is." The words struck like thunderclaps. Guests glanced at one another, some whispering in shock, others openly smiling at Marcus's courage. A waiter near the kitchen doorway even suppressed a grin, his eyes wide with admiration. For the first time, Zhao Liang had no immediate comeback. His mouth opened, then closed, the arrogance on his face cracking like a mask. His entourage shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, others distancing themselves ever so slightly from his chair. Marcus straightened, his shoulders squared as though he had reclaimed not just his dignity, but the dignity of every person who had ever been mocked, belittled, or underestimated. "I don't need to raise my voice," he said, now switching back to English, his tone calm but commanding, "because the truth is louder than any insult you could throw at me." The restaurant erupted, not in chaos, but in quiet, powerful applause. It began with a single pair of hands at the back of the room, then spread like a wave. Diners who had remained silent now joined in, their claps echoing against the marble, their faces lit with admiration. Zhao Liang sat frozen, his wealth and power offering no shield against the storm of respect Marcus had just earned. For once, the billionaire was speechless. The applause rolled through the restaurant like a cleansing storm, washing away the tension that had gripped the air only moments earlier. Marcus didn't smile, didn't revel in the attention. He simply stood there, composed, as if he had only done what was necessary. Zhao Liang, however, sat stiffly in his chair, his pride unraveling before an audience that once admired him for his wealth. Now, every pair of eyes saw him for what he truly was, a man stripped of dignity by his own cruelty. The billionaire's entourage shifted uncomfortably, their once smug faces now tight with embarrassment. They exchanged glances, as if silently questioning whether their loyalty to Zhao was worth the humiliation he had brought upon them. "Enough of this," Zhao barked finally, slamming his palm on the table. His voice, once dripping with superiority, now sounded desperate, hollow. "You're nothing but a waiter. Do you think this performance makes you my equal?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression calm yet resolute. "No," he replied evenly. "It makes me your better." The words sliced through the room with surgical precision. Zhao Liang's jaw tightened, his face flushing with anger. He half rose from his chair, as if to reassert control, but the weight of the silence that followed pinned him back down. Guests at nearby tables leaned closer, some shaking their heads, others whispering to their companions. One older gentleman at the bar, a businessman who had once courted Zhao's investments, muttered under his breath, "All the money in the world, and still the poorest man in the room." Marcus slowly retrieved his notepad from the table, sliding his pen back into his apron pocket. His voice remained steady, but there was no mistaking the quiet authority in his tone. "You see, Mr. Zhao," he said, "the difference between you and me isn't money or power or where we come from. It's respect. You lost this room the moment you opened your mouth, and no amount of wealth can buy back what you've thrown away tonight." A ripple of agreement moved through the diners, soft murmurs of "he's right" and "exactly" that seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. For the first time in years, Zhao Liang found himself outnumbered, not by rivals with greater fortunes, but by ordinary people who refused to bow to his arrogance. Zhao's assistant leaned down and whispered urgently in his ear. Whatever he said made Zhao's face pale. Perhaps it was a reminder of the investors present in the room, or the journalists dining quietly in the corner who had caught every word of Marcus's reply. Whatever it was, Zhao Liang finally realized the truth. He had lost. He pushed back his chair, the screech of metal legs against marble loud and jarring in the otherwise hushed restaurant. His entourage scrambled to their feet, but their movements lacked conviction. Zhao straightened his suit, smoothed his tie, and attempted to mask his defeat with one final, bitter glance at Marcus. But it was too late. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Marcus. Marcus gave a small nod, not gloating, not boastful, but resolute. He turned to walk away, heading back toward the kitchen as if to resume his duties. But before he could leave, the applause swelled again, this time louder, richer, filled with respect. Diners rose from their seats, offering a standing ovation that shook the walls. Some even called out words of encouragement. "You showed him respect. That's how you do it." Marcus paused, his back still to Zhao, and closed his eyes for a brief moment. He hadn't spoken up for applause. He hadn't spoken up for fame. He had spoken up because it was right. And in that moment, he understood something deeper. Dignity, once defended, shines brighter than any diamond a billionaire could ever flaunt. Zhao Liang, humiliated and exposed, stormed out with his entourage trailing awkwardly behind. His departure was a stark contrast to the grand entrance he had made earlier that evening. The billionaire who thought himself untouchable had been reduced to silence by the very man he mocked. As the door closed behind him, the restaurant seemed lighter, freer, as though a shadow had finally lifted. Back in the kitchen, Marcus leaned against the counter, letting out a slow breath. His fellow staff members gathered around him, their faces glowing with pride. One of the younger waiters clapped him on the back. "You didn't just stand up for yourself," he said. "You stood up for all of us." Marcus smiled faintly. "No one deserves to be treated like they're less than human," he replied. "Not here, not anywhere." And with that, he tied his apron back into place, returning to the floor as though nothing extraordinary had happened, though every single person in that restaurant knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. The story of that night would spread beyond the walls of the restaurant. Guests would recount it to friends, who would pass it along again and again. Soon, it became more than just an incident. It became a lesson, a reminder that arrogance can fall in seconds, but dignity endures forever. And that night, the world learned a timeless truth. Money might open doors, but respect opens hearts. Marcus's courage turned humiliation into honor and silence into applause. What do you think? Was Zhao's downfall deserved? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button if you believe dignity will always outshine arrogance. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.